All right, hard yarners. Firstly, before we get to our guest, Dana Pham, we are brought to you today by alltradescover.com.au. All Trades Cover, insurance company that Delby isn't here to tell you who they cover or what they don't cover, but they were going to cover the liability insurance. That's definitely something they do cover. I know that, but they're specialise in the trade, small businesses and sole traders specifically. So get around alltradescover.com.au. Make sure you drop our name and hopefully that starts directing some money towards us. And we love the guys at All Trades Cover. This episode is also brought to you by Feed. Feed is a supplement that is completely animal-based. It is locally sourced, ethically sourced, and very bioavailable because of the fact that it is animal-based. You can get the beef liver, the organ complex, the collagen, honey, oysters are their most popular supplement, and you're going to get all of that goodness because it is animal-based. It's more bioavailable. You're not going to piss it out in your daily rituals in the morning. So get around Feed. Please use the code word hard yarn. And this episode is also brought to you by Goat Tape. Goat Tape helps you breathe easily at night while you're running, doing exercise. I've been using the mouth tape lately. Bloody awesome, actually. It's definitely noticeable. When you wear it through the night, you wake up just feeling like you're going to pop out of bed. So I definitely recommend getting around Go Tape. So thank you so much to all of those sponsors. Use the code word HARDYARN for 10 to 15% off. And really appreciate you guys always being on board. But today, our guest, Dana Pham, joined us via Zoom over in Sydney. Are you at the moment?
That's correct, yes.
So Dana is a trans activist, a philosopher, we learned as well, and among other things. But do you recall, we did have quite a long, in-depth conversation. So do you recall what we spoke about?
All the controversial issues relating to trans, parental rights, children transitioning, the medical process, conflicts of people's freedoms, whose freedoms are more important, trans people, the freedoms of trans people or the freedom of others in society. All the controversial topics in the trans world that you can think of.
It was actually a really good conversation. I'm glad we had this. Having conversations with people that have potentially opposition views, even though we actually tend to agree on quite a lot, strangely enough, in this conversation. So, but very good. I'm so stoked that this is what you're doing and trying to reach out to people like us and other sort of podcasters and those sorts of things. I think it's a really good way of getting that message across. So listeners, you're going to really enjoy this conversation. Very insightful, and I'm glad we can bridge a gap. So without further ado, let's get hard.
Welcome to Hard Yarns Podcast.
I am fucking fat.
Anything Chris White says, please disregard it.
5D is actually a state of being. It's a unity consciousness.
That was Hard Yarns with me, Frankie Rose. So I'm going to throw it over to your co-host,
Daniel Delby.
And Cameron Branch.
I would do this and then I'd gong.
Free in attendance for the millions listening at home. Let's get hard.
Thanks so much for joining us. Really appreciate your time. This is good. These are the conversations I've been wanting to start to have for quite a while, and you were recommended by a mutual friend, Rebecca Barnett. So thanks to her for setting this up. It's really good. Firstly, maybe give it a brief sort of background into who you are and what you're here to talk about.
Sure. Great to be here. My name is Dana Pham. I'm all sorts of things, but what I was going to say was, where do we start?
Yeah.
So I'm a trans woman, but I'm not just a trans woman. Everyone's all sorts of things. I'm involved in political activities. But I'm not your typical trans rights activist. I'll clear that up. I like to I get involved in the political process, but I take a few strange turns If you go to a Sydney protest in Sydney and it's a left-wing protest, there's a chance that you might see me there counter-protesting.
Okay.
Although the Sydney protest scene, since I think it's October the 7, 2 years ago, that's kind of ruined the scene. But usually if there's a left-wing protest, especially if it's related to trans issues, you're likely to see me rock up there doing some sort of counter-protest with some sort of counter-sign. And it's usually to try to start a different conversation. When we think of debates and conversations, there's a tendency for us to think black and white, blue team, red team, and then there's no shades of grey in between, which, well, it's complicated. And as much as mainstream media likes to portray protests or parliamentary debates, whatever protest or debate or whatever conversation it is, as if it's black and white, when it really isn't black and white. So I'm just thinking more of more recent infamous protests. I'd rock up in counter-protests, so to speak. There was a lady from the UK, Kelly Jane Keane, I think that's the name, or otherwise known as Posey Parker, very provocative women's rights advocate or sex-based rights advocate from the UK, came to Australia in early 2023, and if I remember correctly, I had a whole bunch of signs basically indicating that I'm trans and conservative, and by the way, my views are a little bit more nuanced, and some in the Kelly J. Keane or Posey Parker crowd, it kind of irked them, but I really irked the Pride in protests, the left-wing LGBTQ protesters on the other side of Victoria Park in the Sydney CBD. But I'm open to, not being black and white, and I love having conversations with people who also don't want to be black and white.
Yeah, that's very interesting. So in regards to going to those sorts of protests, the left wings are generally full of almost the extreme opinions and the extreme views of the left, the stereotypical blue-haired, screaming, middle-aged white woman seems to be the stereotype, but that's what you sort of expect to see at these sorts of protests, the allies. And I do feel like, even from my point of view, from people who maybe have a bit more of a nuanced position on this, that's what's almost ruined any sort of easy conversation with this. It's like it's being thrown in your face by people who don't care what your opinion is. So what sort of conversations are you having there? Are you trying to break down walls so there's a bit more of a conversation about it?
There's several aspects, and probably a whole bunch more. There's an assumption that if you have some sort of LGBTQ label, you're probably left-wing or you're centre-left. If you approach your typical trans person, whether online or in real life, they're probably not going to be Christian. They probably are going to be some sort of socialist or social democrat, big government, that kind of preferred approach. They think government should be involved in a whole bunch of things, clamping down on hate speech, for example, just a general a coddling and a creation of some new elite classes. You often hear from Australian sex-based rights advocates. You had one on your show recently, Sal Grover, that there is some truth to the statement that trans people have kind of become one of the most protected classes in Australia, which is unfortunate because it sends a signal that we're simultaneously precious,
The
we're
victim.
narcissistic, we're a whole bunch of not so great things that aren't really great conversation starters. Now, I don't hold centre right, right wing, conservative, whatever label you want to slap on me. I don't hold those views just for the sake of being provocative. Like if I'm going to hold political views, I should hold those views because I actually believe in them. And I've had my own journey over the years, shifting rightwards, so to speak. But there is a common sense that lies in that. And if you look at, the last couple of decades, it's just a speck in human history. But for the majority of human history, so over the span of at least a couple thousand years, a lot of societal concepts, granted that there are different cultures throughout the world, but a lot of societal concepts, they remained the same, constant, consistent until the last couple of decades. So, for example, call it gender theory, call it gender ideology. It's not that they lack complete merits, so much so that they deserve complete, they don't deserve any understanding at all. There is some merit, but it's become very ideological. This is the 1984 worldview. We're trying to make this the 1984 worldview. Get on board or you're a bigot. No, that's the end of the debate. But if you really want people, look, I think if gender ideology wasn't rammed down our throats so much, I think your Sal Grovers of the world, I think they wouldn't feel cornered. I do feel, I found it interesting when she came on your show, she made the point that for whatever reason, it wasn't until I think it was 2020 that she was made aware that there's this thing called gender theory and there are these gender ideologues, these gender activists online and in person ramming this down for people's throats and doing it in a very unsavory way. Now, if she hadn't been exposed to any of that and someone, I don't know, a normal-looking trans person, e.g. me, shameless advertising here, approached her and just, had normal conversations and did normal things like normal people do at the weekend barbecue or picnic or what have you, where people get to know each other in a normal way. Maybe she'd have, and her app didn't get cancelled, maybe she'd have a different view of trans people now. Maybe perhaps a level of uncomfortableness. And I acknowledge there would be a level of uncomfortableness because I've made life choices. I lead a life that's very different to 99% of people for very specific reasons, in very specific ways. But, everyone's different and somehow we need to get along, and eventually we do get along. It's just a question of who's putting in the effort to get along and who isn't.
The fact that they all seem to support the same thing suggests there has been almost an ideological, almost politicization of the topic, I think, and that's hurt the transgender movement in itself. That's not to suggest we need to. This is the balance of where do we find compassion with also, I guess, a balance of logic, reasoning, and sort of what we know to be true. And I think there's a pathway there, but it seems to have been hijacked politically and ideologically by the left in this extreme left area as this thing that's being rammed down our throats, and it does hurt any conversation that could happen because very largely and widely across the board, the majority of people would say you're allowed to do and feel and think whatever you want. That's your business. And they're quite fine with that. And it doesn't seem to be people like yourself. You seem to be quite a lot more reasonable about this. But there are people who go way too far. And a lot of the time, it doesn't even seem to be the transgender community.
Yes, I mean, we live in an age, you go back a couple of centuries ago, what were the ideas running society? Religion, the early stages of the scientific revolution, all these ideas of tradition and progress, not progress in the contemporary sense, progress in a really interesting sense. Like, it must have been a really interesting time when, I can't remember if it was actually Nikola Tesla or Thomas Edison who came up with the light bulb. I might be confusing it with another fellow. Anyway,
honestly, I think it was Tesla invented it and Edison stole it. But
what I do remember is Edison does take a little more credit than we give him. Anyway, those men who, and some women, whose the giants that we sit on their shoulders, that era and before that, those giants, those men and women, the giants who we sit on their shoulders today, they're the interesting ideas. I'm trying to remember where I'm going with this. I guess where I'm going with this is we don't actually, I know where I'm going with this. We no longer live in those interesting times. Unfortunately, we thought we'd have flying cars by now, as the Jetsons seem to imply to us. Mm-hmm. Well, we came up with smartphones, or I like to call them dumb phones. We came up with social media. Not a bad idea. I mean, I look at your platform and it's a great platform, but we know that social media has been used for not so great reasons. And, we're not really imaginative. So if you live in a society where you're not being imaginative enough, okay, Elon Musk has been a bit imaginative with Tesla and what have you. Yeah. But if we live in a society where we're dumbed down with dumb phones and, well, what is there left? You take up the cause that's the zeitgeist, the flavour of the month.
Yeah. Well,
the flavour of the month, the zeitgeist, maybe it's waning this year and maybe it'll wane even further next year. But up to recently, the zeitgeist included diversity, equity, and inclusion, especially trans issues. That's not really compatible with the invention of the light bulb. The brothers that invented flying about 100 years ago, I can't remember the name. Those were far more interesting ideas and things of invention. Now it's, I care about trans rights because I care about trans people because, in a predominantly religionless society and got a bit of Elon Musk things going on. Oh, what else is there to do? Jump on the bandwagon.
Trend.
Yeah, that's unfortunately the society we live in, which means, yes, you get some actual trans people who cause a ruckus, like Pride and Protest, although they've been a bit more well-behaved of late. For your viewers who don't know who Pride and Protest is, they're a faction in the Mardi Gras community in Sydney, and I understand where they're coming from. They think Mardi Gras has been corporatized, and I sympathise with that. But especially this is going back 2021 to 2023, these were the guys that were, there were the people that, they didn't go this far, but there were people that would care about the environment so much that they would somehow glue themselves to the bitumen of the road. Although they didn't go that, they were just very disruptive in Sydney. Maybe they finally realised, okay, well, if we want to influence the Mardi Gras community, we should be a bit more behaved. But I've had a few run-ins with them. They know who I am, and one of them is watching me right now. Hello, hi, catch you around again. They weren't a fan of me when I took a different position to Posey Park and themselves, and there were these other protests. I counter-protested to that, and I've written about this in a few Spectator Australia articles. Strange times, and yeah, that may be a reference to me, but I seem to remember, because older books and older records, historical records, seems to indicate that people used to have more nuanced conversations. Now it's about the sound bites, and if it's about the sound bites, oh no, you can't have 3 or 4, 5 or 6 sides. You can only have 2 sides, because it goes back to the point I made that we live in the dumb phone era. Got to keep it simple, and you keep it too simple, it's too simplistic, and this is the situation we're in, where we've got Tickle v Giggle as well, and things that came out of that, which whilst I may not entirely agree with Sal on every single thing she said in your show, I read that federal court judgment. Well, I'm a non-lawyer, so I try to read the whole thing. And the part that irked me the most was apparently in 2021, Sal and Roxanne, the complainant, they had a bit of apparently a civilized Twitter debate about the MacGyver ladies' spa down at Coogee. That's a ladies-only swimming pool in Coogee back in Sydney, and they had a little apparently civilized debate. And then that's when Roxanne figured out that Sal is the CEO of the Giggle app at the time. And knowing what Sal is about, because apparently they had that toing and throwing over women's space. The complainant, Roxanne Tickle, knew what Sal was about, knew what Sal's values were and what she stood for, knew that it was a women's-only app, and yet chose to join the app anyway.
It's almost provocative, isn't it?
There are many apps out there, and I don't think, like dumb phones, I don't think apps and social media has necessarily added real value to human society, but plenty out there. It's a free choice, but Tickle decided to join Giggle instead. Roxanne Tickle had a choice, but chose to be a troll instead. Yeah. It's clearly troll.
Yeah.
Because look at the situation now.
And as a trans person yourself, how does that make you feel? Because these are the things that people do get passionate about. I'm a father of a daughter, and of course I have some concerns as well as the mental health side of things. I'm not saying and suggesting that every trans person has a mental health problem or bipolar or any of these sorts of conditions, but it doesn't take a genius to understand that some people could abuse this system as well, and these laws that are being passed. Sure. So there are concerns, and so when when these sorts of ideas are being sort of almost heightened and escalated by people who are going out of their way to provoke and to make it worse, that can't help the whole agenda that, I mean, as far as I can tell, you just want to live your life peacefully and just be a transgender person. Something like that, yes.
We'll start off with a few basic questions. the provocative, which I don't think it's provocative, but apparently it's provocative. So the question of what is a woman? Now, we've seen the both sides say, one side says, I think it's adult female human. I think I've got the order of those three words correct.
The noun,
And
yeah.
the other side will flail. They would, oh, I'm not a biologist. I don't, and all these pathetic answers. It's not a middle road I'm taking. But I think it's real. It's more realistic to say, well, biologically, one side is correct biologically, but a woman is. You walk down the street. Let's say you and I didn't know each other, and you hadn't met me before, and I know that there's one thing about me physically that kind of gives away that I'm a trans woman, and that's my voice, and I'm very cognizant of that. So let's say I zip my mouth, you and I don't know each other, I walk down the streets, we are in the same capital city, I walk down the streets, your brain would just register man, woman, oh, there's Dana, woman, oh, actually, you don't know who I am, you don't even know my name's Dana, it just registers woman, assuming I zip my mouth and don't say anything. That is a woman. I'm not saying that is biologically correct because that is a biologically incorrect answer. But this is reality. You go to Coles and Woolies. You're not. You're going through the aisles. You're not thinking, oh, is that a woman down that in this aisle down there? No. You're too busy buying your groceries.
Well, and I completely understand what you're suggesting there. My concern is when we try and explain the nuance of this discussion to kids, and where we just say, no, you are a woman or you are a man, and like my 7-year-old can know. There's no way she can understand the nuanced ideas and discussions that are surrounded by this, and so if she was to be confused and believe that she could be a man or she could be a woman or whatever she wants to do, because of the influence of these sorts of ideas that are being put into her brain through a schooling system, I think that's where we're getting a lot of pushback in that area. And this idea of puberty blockers and at such a young age. So let's go back to there as well, because that's a really quite a divisive part of this topic, I think, and it's teaching this sort of stuff in schools, which I think has no place in a school system. And I understand sexual education once you get to a certain age and once you can start to understand these nuanced ideas, but kindergartens, pre-primaries, this isn't what I want my daughter to be learning.
Right. So, I mean, this relates to women's spaces. All these trans issues, they relate. One of the other fundamentals is, who's the parent of your children? Is it the state or is it you, the parent? Well, common sense says, well, you're the parent. You gave, you and your spouse, you gave birth to your child. You're the parent, not the state. If we, and of course, our education system broadly is captured, but in the day, this is why there are parents taking their children out of schools and homeschooling their kids because of the concerns you've raised. You come to Newtown. For your viewers who don't know Newtown, Sydney, it's a very LGBTQ part of Sydney. Look, the parents there, they're going to very likely be LGBTQ friendly. And if for whatever reason they're okay with their kids being, well, hopefully not too graphically, but being exposed to some sort of queer theory, even at young ages, well, at the end of the day, they're the parents. But you, as the parent, not from Newtown, I assume you're not from Newtown, you have parental choice. And what we've seen governments in the West, they've been attempts to encroach on that parental choice, on that parental right, that the primary source of education, whilst school teachers help out with that, the primary source of education and the ultimate arbiter of that is the parent. So you can see I'm trying to be consistent here. Some Newtown parent in Sydney, they're queer friendly. Okay, whatever. It's your children. As for you, you should also have a choice to have a say on what goes into your kids' education. You shouldn't be. Depending on your state government in Australia, you could be bound to a certain postcode. Well, what if all the schools, postcode is teaching stuff that you don't want to see be taught and taught to your children? Well, that's not much of a choice. And of course, homeschooling is frowned upon in Australia, at least from what I can tell. So yes, there are choices, but to really push for that choice as a parent in Australia, it can be difficult. But as a general rule, I thought, and I had this idea years ago, and for your viewers' benefit, I medically transitioned in the late 2000s. So this is well over 10 years ago that, hormonally and surgically, I've gone through a rigmarole, so to speak. But going back all those years ago, I had I'd like to call them common sense assumptions. So I already mentioned one of them. Well, what's a woman when you walk down the street? And what does your brain tells you, kind of a common sense assumption. The other thing I thought to myself was, well, if there was a child has seen a psychologist, has pretty bad gender dysphoria, and with everyone's involvement in the process, it is decided that, yep, they're particularly young, so obviously no puberty blockers. They're not of that age yet, but they can socially transition. And then this child in primary school rocks up one day, used to be a boy, is now presenting as a girl. I would have thought the conversation would have just been, from a teacher, so-and-so is now a girl, and that's the end of conversation. And it should be a mutual obligation in that, okay, now that you're presenting as the opposite gender, maybe don't play the fluidity game and, not cause more scandal, try to keep your head down. There's no need for the theory behind that to be taught.
Would you say
there's plenty of other concepts that are more adult concepts, and I don't mean adult in the sexual way, just adult concepts in general. Those things can be taught in an age-appropriate way. Child in primary school rocks up in a different gender. Sure, the teacher should make clear they now this gender. Let's not get into gender theory. In my view, there's no real need for that.
Yeah. Would you? From my opinion, I'd look at a child being in that situation as. I'd look at it as it's almost, in my opinion, I'd feel like it's almost child abuse because they're not at the age where I think they can make a practical decision. There's a reason we can't drink at certain ages, drive at certain ages, and get tattoos, make lifelong altering decisions at that sort of age. And you were obviously a lot older when you made your transition, and then we can talk about detransitioning and some of the horror stories that we see in that as well, because there is this idea of, like, especially as a child, you are willing to go along with ideas and fads and things. And not that I'm trying to compare like the gothic trend to transgender trends, but I'm just going to use that as an example. If you're in a group of people who say, yeah, cool, I'm going to identify as a woman now and I'm going to be in that sort of area, you're going to be influenced by the people around you. And sometimes you wouldn't feel like that, just like I might smoke when I don't want to smoke because we're kids.
Sure.
And so my fear would be like maybe there is one or two that actually have this body dysmorphia where they truly do believe that they are, or maybe they're confusing their sexual tendencies or their sexual preferences potentially. This is the issue: is when they're a kid, who knows what the answer is, and I'm not sure it even has a place in schools to begin with.
So the first question that comes to my mind is, how do you define child abuse, and what's the how broad or narrow that definition is? So I'm a practicing Catholic. You'll tend to, if you do a Google search for me, you'll see a lot of stuff on religion that I blog and post about and what have you. I had someone. I asked a question because I knew that he was a Christian. He wasn't a fan of Catholics. And we were having a similar debate. I asked him, do you think Catholicism, Catholic parents raising their children Catholic, as opposed to, in this guy's case, he was an evangelical Christian, is raising your child Catholic child abuse? And he thought, yes. He genuinely thought, and of course, I was raised Catholic myself, and I completely reject the claim that being raised Catholic is child abuse. Something else, another situation that comes to mind is, I believe Jehovah's Witness, those folks, for religious reasons, they don't believe in blood transfusion. And depending on the state you live in Australia, and I haven't quite caught up with the laws in this regard in recent times, if a Jehovah's Witness parent, their child is injured and they need a blood transfusion, I believe that parent could still refuse the hospital to provide that blood transfusion to that child. Now, is that child abuse? Or is that, and you can see I'm trying to be consistent with parental rights here.
Yeah.
Whether it's the parental rights of some queer-friendly parents in Newtown, or yourself and others like-minded, or Jehovah's Witness parents, these principles, I think, need to be applied universally if we're going to talk about these freedoms and liberties. So do I think the religion of Jehovah's Witness is child abuse? Well, I'm not a fan of it, and I've got all these theological disagreements. But if I'm going to start making comments like, those Jehovah's Witnesses and those parents, they're very bad parents, government, I need you to come in and get involved in. That's not a consistent position. And how do you define child abuse? Some parents, let me rephrase that. I think a lot of parents today wouldn't smack their child in the bum. I'm sure some do. And if I had children, there might be a temptation on my part to be like, oh, well, I was smacked on the bum when I was a child. Well, why can't? But yeah. I'm very well aware of the kind of society we live in and the kind of state government agencies who are very keen to get involved in these kind of matters. And then if I had children, I think little Johnny over there needs to be smacked in the bum. But, what if someone sees it? So then who gets to define child abuse? And I'm not saying that's a good thing. That's not a great thing.
Yeah.
And then for a topic like,
specifically when
children,
when it results in surgery, and then they're in a situation where they have been victim of a trend and they're fallen into the crowd, and it was being pushed by the parents to go down that path, I guess that would fall into the category potentially. But I understand what you're saying. Like, it's very hard. If you're going to say that's child abuse, where does it end? Because you're basically putting your beliefs onto your own child. So I understand what you're suggesting there.
But in terms of addressing your concerns, that's not to say other things couldn't be done to allay your concerns. So, as I said, why should any gender theory, gender ideology, why should any of that be taught anywhere in our classrooms from kinder to year 12? We've seen the news items over years to do with the 3Rs. Seems like some teachers, or maybe more than some teachers, have forgotten about that. So what are the 3Rs? Reading, writing, arithmetic. And we've seen the news reports over the years that that's been on the decline in Australia. Why isn't that being addressed? Like, they're really basic things. Why not? And of course, we then see other news items of certain things that are being taught in our schools, whether it's the occasional news story about, some age-inappropriate book at the school library that, talks about being trans or in a grotesque way or whatever. We've heard of them before. But then there's also, boys in schools being hammered down with your domestic violence, consent, that kind of education. I'm not saying some of those topics aren't important, but I've seen news items where they're taught in a way that degrades boys, and it can be taught in a way that makes boys feel ashamed of being boys. There's a whole bunch of stuff in schools that are being taught, that we're told that are being taught or potentially being taught, and it's just not on. And, the 3Rs, they're on the decline. We're really getting our priorities wrong here. Teachers, curriculum bureaucrats, they all have that kind of power. That's very concerning, especially if you as a parent don't seem to have too much choice. But that can be addressed, and I really believe that should be addressed in Australia. And look, and it's not just the teachers, it's also your psychologists. The Queensland government, I think it was a few months ago, they started a review into gender clinics in Queensland. And I saw a news item about this, I think it was in February this year, that there's a gender clinic in Cairns. Now, when I think of far north Queensland, I think, it's a more conservative part of Australia. They wouldn't be crazy. I saw a news item that in a preliminary finding as part of this Queensland government review, out of the 42 or 43, there were 42 or 43 children who had gone through the clinic and it didn't meet guidelines that those cases should have met.
Okay.
And now when I hear a story like that, it's very concerning, obviously, but it's also very disappointing because we have these guidelines, but of course, psychologists, like teachers, like other institutions, they've been captured. And, I would have thought that psychs would be more careful. It turns out, at least in this Cairns gender clinic case, they weren't.
Okay.
So if you've got that kind of statistic, it makes you wonder, what about all these other gender clinics in Australia? So that's more of my concern than the principle itself. Well, the principle in this case, if child's been seeing a psych, it's very obvious to the parents that child's very unhappy with their gender dysphoria. It's gone too much. The parents have put in at least some effort to steer the child in a gender reality direction. Hasn't worked. Mind you, these things have been tried on me as a teenager. Didn't really work, and I really wished I was. I did transition as a teenager, but anyway, if there was the effort put into, if people involved put in the effort to make sure that this is the right decision, so to speak, you wouldn't hear these stories. Well, we're starting to hear these stories in Australia, which, okay, not a surprise. It really shouldn't have happened, but it's happened.
Yeah.
And it puts me in an awkward position when I say, oh, but, there's a tiny percentage of, like, well below 1% of the general population who, they would have benefited from a child transition. But I'm relying on my experience growing up. And then when you have these cases unfold in the UK, in the US, and now in Australia, of course, it's embarrassing for me because I'm in this awkward position.
Yeah, it definitely. I don't think all things reflect the thoughts and feelings of all transgender people. And it's not a broad brush that covers everyone. So all of their decisions, the efforts that they put into the thoughts on transitioning and what they're feeling. But then where is the line between mental health and ideology and what we're seeing with transitioning? Because I know that it's well over 50% of transgender patients who have considered suicide. Now, you could argue whether or not that is because of societal pressures or whether that was they've had the mental illness prior to these thoughts and that's what's resulted into it, making them feel accepted into a group potentially. Chicken and egg. I'm not going to try and know what the answer is. I don't think it's been studied thoroughly enough to know. Maybe you can point me in the right direction there, but that seems to be one of the things that I've been looking at lately and questioning.
Sure. So the study I believe you just referred to is a 2011 Swedish study, and I've seen the toing and froing over that particular study. It's kind of like during the pandemic, the case numbers. Did they die of COVID, or did they die with COVID? It's a similar situation with that 2011 Swedish study. Did they, is it of or with? And of course, I'm trans myself. I know that my life's been complicated and this, I can be a complicated person. It's kind of a moot point, what I said as well, and I believe in what I say because, again, medical academia also captured. So, who are we meant to believe? I've seen some of the more recent studies that have been heavily criticised by trans activists, and I kind of see where they're coming from. But there's also a sense of exaggeration. I mean, this whole matter has gotten so messy. Like this debate, this conversation has gotten so messy that to figure out in a truly rigorous scientific sense what's fact, what's not, what's the best way forward medically and scientifically, well, it's, where do we start? We've got a Swedish study from more than 10 years ago that is debatable. I mean, we've got, these other studies over years that say, the regret rate is only 1% and the only way forward is affirmation, and that's debatable. And you've got all these different studies, and what do you believe? If the institution's captured, well, where do you start?
Well, even when it comes to, there have been some positive studies I've seen that post-transition, the mental health improves, and I've seen those studies as well. I made sure I've been looking into both sides because I'm not an arsehole who just has an opinion and just sticks with it. I like to see both sides. But, the mental health side of things it's an interesting thing, and it gets heightened by politically, and they start to turn it into a black and white issue, like you said at the start. So I think there does have to be a lot more nuanced discussion about it. But if really the mental health, like what does it do for your mental health, for example, if I start going, okay, you're a woman, even though I think in my head, no, she's a man, but I'm trying to be kind. Does that help your mental health? Does that improve the people's mental health that are transitioning? From your opinion, or is this just like I'm serving someone's delusion from some people's point of view, or am I escalating their own mental health issues? It's a very challenging thing to navigate as someone who's trying to be kind. I'm not like everyone else. I'll be kind to you. I'd be compassionate. But when it comes down to laws and suggesting that I have to say certain things and the speech is limited and I have to acknowledge certain things, that's when it gets scary, which we're starting to see. But yeah, where are your thoughts on that in regards to the mental health? Because you would obviously know that people might be saying something to your face but think something else.
Well, very quickly, I gathered that we'd probably agree with each other a lot on what we think the laws should be. And this kind of relates to what I'm about to say, which is I think, and this is not just for myself, I think it's also good advice for other trans people, although I don't necessarily think it would be well received, but I'm happy to be proven wrong. And I think this is just good advice for people in general. It's important to have a integrated, a broad and integrated worldview. Not just have patches of a worldview that then when you try to line them up, they're not particularly well aligned. Now that's a bit of a fluffy statement. Well, what do I mean in practice? Okay, so I have a history of gender dysphoria, and I had that growing up, and it was pretty bad. So, and I refer back to principles. If we can't rely on the science because the institutions have been captured, we can always fall back on principles, and this is why I'm passionate about philosophy and theology. And I'm about to close to finishing my master's in theology through Notre Dame here in Australia. So where was I going with that? Okay, clearly, what's the principle that I yearned for growing up? Freedom of expression. Okay, just cut out all the nitty-gritty details. Well, what is it really about? Freedom of expression, so that, I'm not having dysphoria just eating into my head, eating into my mind, which then affects my work, my studies, my whatever in terms of general living, that my life doesn't become so badly impaired that I'm not living, so to speak. Freedom of expression. Okay? So if I want freedom of expression, which is one type of freedom, so what about the freedom of speech? Well, okay, the freedom of expression of others, and not just that, freedom of speech, freedom of association, freedom of a whole bunch of freedoms. I like to call them US First Amendment style freedoms. Not the you have a right to education or you have a right to health. Those are more positive rights. I'm more thinking of negative rights. So the kind of freedoms that libertarians like to harp on about. if I want some level of freedom for myself, then I need to be very mindful that maybe others would like that as well. And it becomes a negotiation, a social negotiation. I remember during the late 2010s when Jordan Peterson was embroiled in the forced speech debate. One of the points that stuck with me was he talked about, well, just with speech in general, it's just a social negotiation. So what you've just done there, what you said about out of politeness, I think that's what you were trying to get at.
Yep.
You would say use female pronouns. This is us socially negotiating, and you can see we didn't consciously think of it. But all you did was explain your thought process, but you didn't consciously think of it. You just said what felt natural, and it felt natural because it is normal for people to socially negotiate. So if I want some sort of freedom of expression, in my case, present as a woman, be on some sort of hormone replacement therapy. In my case, I had one type of surgery. I obviously have to be mindful that this is a population of 8 billion people wherever we're at. I need to live with others just as others need to live with me. And I don't mean in a forced way where we start forcing each other down each other's throats, because then you get civil wars and it gets ugly very quickly. Politically, I'm a libertarian. I think trans people should be more libertarian. They want freedom of expression for themselves, then there are some rules, and the less messier rules are your freedom type, your libertarian kind of rules. You're more likely to achieve some sort of level of mutual respect. Sal said what she needed to say when she was on your show, some which I wasn't entirely on board on, but she did emphasize on a number of occasions, you do you. Doesn't necessarily mean that's a entirely good thing, because, well, if I want to do me, can I punch someone? Clearly not.
Yeah.
I can't just do whatever I want. But we know what she meant. And I think all it takes is a Roxanne tickle to force someone into a corner where, again, she still made comments along the lines of you do you, but you can see, rightly so, she got so worked up about what she's gone through. I mean, I would be worked up as well. And this is this awkward situation we're in. Something for trans people, for people in general to be mindful of. I am seeing, so the older generation of trans people, I can see that they're mindful, but the younger, I'm not necessarily talking about younger in physical age, I'm talking about younger in their transition, those who transitioned more recently, especially in the last decade in the West. I can see there's at least a little bit more narcissism than those who transitioned in the 2000s and the 90s.
Why do you think that
we're
is?
starting to see that. It's a little too narcissistic.
Why do you think that is? Is it a level of entitlement that just comes with the newer age? Or do you think these are people who are not necessarily there for the right reasons sometimes, and it's just even a group that they feel accepted in?
So potentially a combination of all, but I think it's overwhelmingly more, oh, great, they're now teaching gender theory in schools rather than fixing people's 3 Rs. Mardi Gras keeps getting bigger and bigger, and there's so much rainbowness, there's so much pride. And of course, what follows pride is the fall. And in this case, the fall of, oh, this is normal now, and I'm going to take this for granted, and I'm just going to potentially have a sense of entitlement, whether consciously or not. And
because that's just
it
the
gets
world
in
we
the
live
way
in.
of proper conversation.
That just seems to be the world we live in. It doesn't necessarily mean that's only in the transgender movement. That's in
Yes.
a lot of different movements, that sort of sense of entitlement and almost, I want it, I don't care what you say, I'm getting it right now sort of attitude. A lack of resilience that we see in the world now. So potentially that's it's escalated, and it's again, we keep going back to it, that politicization of it, and sometimes they're highlighted to draw emotional reactions so we can create this division that we see in society. And this is why I want to have conversations like this. Like, I truly believe this is a good chat. This is a good way to bridge gaps and find understanding that not all transgender people are raging, screaming lunatics, of which there are some. But there are the other way as well. There's arsehole rednecks who are just dickheads as well. So I get that. But yeah, it just seems like the tensions are escalated almost intentionally. Are you seeing this from a politicised sort of point of view?
Why have a conventional war when you've got trade wars and culture wars and all these other types of wars? You know, the Anzacs will probably look at the kind of wars we have now and shake their heads thinking, well, back in my day, I was in a trench in Gallipoli, and you guys are having these kind of... Anyway.
But that group seems to have also hijacked, to a point, the LGB community to the LGBTQI plus now. And that was sexual orientation versus now what seems to be gender ideology or gender identification. And they're not necessarily the same, and they've been lumped into this same group. Some don't like that, some do. And I can't see why they are together, because one is sexual orientation.
Well, I've got complicated thoughts about this specific subtopic. And it's obviously a talking point amongst sex-based rights advocates. I think they should be lumped together, but the reason I think that is, other than the fact that these are a whole bunch of labels outside your, shall we say, cisgender, heteronormative, the cisgender, cis heteronormative model. It's outside of that normal model. Obviously, there's no relation between gender identity and sexual relation. But if you had an integrated view of the world, so this is a cis heteronormative point I'm about to make, has its roots in Christianity, for example. What's the point? It's the principle of what's the point of sex? So a traditionalist view would be, well, the point of sex is to generate children, and that you really shouldn't be having sex for reasons other than trying to have children naturally with a spouse of yours. You know, as soon as you deviate a little further away from that model, then you can put in LGBTQ. You can put a whole bunch of labels into that basket.
Okay.
So I feel that this is coming from a Christian/Catholic perspective. It just makes sense to me to put it all in the same basket, because it was the view I was brought up with, and it's the view despite some difficult grapplings between me being trans, me being Catholic, but I wrestle on the side. It seems straightforward in that sense. Excuse the pun.
And how would you know that you're not just gay? Like, how do you know you're not just? So you said you had gender dysphoria. as a condition. I guess that's diagnosed by a physician. Is gender dysphoria then considered by you as a mental health condition?
We as a society, we've accepted it as it's that diagnosis in this manual called the DSM, DSM-5, because we've decided as a society it's going to be in the 5th version of DSM. Like, it's very arbitrary. And psychiatry, psychology, how long that's been around for? It's been around for, like, modern psychology, it's been around for as long as Freud and Jung have been around for, which is what, less than 200 years? So it's very arbitrary in that sense. I'm not trying to then dismiss the DSM-5 and all the psychiatric diagnoses in that manual. I'm not saying, it's all rubbish and fake. It's just something to be mindful of. It's a way to help us make sense of the world. Like, if you...
Because it is your reality, I guess.
Well, if we want to dig further philosophically, you could ask, okay, forget about the DSM, forget about what psychiatry and psychology is saying. Can you, Dana, describe gender dysphoria? And, I'll probably say things like, well, I felt like a girl trapped in a boy's body, and a lot of those talking points that you're probably familiar with.
Yeah.
But then if you really dug in deeper, well, what does that mean? Like, how do you know? Like, how do you know what it feels like how it feels like for a woman to menstruate, for example? Admittedly, if you try to dig deeper with me, we'd probably end up going around in circles. Of course, that's not very helpful. It's not really getting to base principles. It then comes across as incoherent philosophy. And,
so does that
go on.
So does that make this process of transition a way to deal with a mental health condition?
An imperfect way of dealing with the issue, yes.
Okay.
A highly imperfect way of dealing with gender dysphoria, in regards to the medical process that's available to us.
Okay. So that's interesting to me. So does that mean you potentially could consider, now obviously you've come all the way to transitioning, so I doubt you're going to detransition and go back, but is this a way that you could dig to the bottom and go, okay, why am I feeling this? This is the reality. This is the body that I have been given. I need to understand that reality and accept it, and I can work around that and then change my ideas around this body dysphoria, or is that not the case?
So
almost like another analogy would be, medicating for depression. Obviously, it's helpful. It helps having a medicine, but there's always an underlying core contributing. Not always, but there's there's a core issue at the core of it all that you can get to it. Maybe a childhood trauma or something like that. Is there something that we can look at with transgender people?
Right. So the key word here is alleviation, whereas for at least some of the trans rights activists, it's identity or identity politics. Really, the focus should be on alleviation. Now, does that get to the core? Obviously not. It's alleviation. Methods of alleviating dysphoria. Looking at my life, I mean, what started it all? I don't know. I've had, more than 3 decades to think about this. I don't know. I still don't have an answer.
And I'm interested,
what started it all? Like, what's at the core?
Yeah.
Number 1, what's at the core? Number 2, well, how do you know what it feels like to a woman? It feels like to be a woman if you've never menstruated, never had the capacity to give birth, blah, blah, blah. These 2 questions, I don't really have satisfactory answers other than the unsatisfactory answer of, well, living as a man doesn't feel right. So if I lived in a world where everyone was men, boys and men, so only biological males, I seem to remember growing up, one of the animes I watched was Dragon Ball Z, and I think they had a species, I can't remember what they were called. It was a species of people who green-skinned, and some of you viewers might remember that from Dragon Ball Z.
Yeah, I can't.
They're all biologically men. You know, if I lived in that kind of society, maybe nothing would have, I wouldn't have had any dysphoria, or I would have had dysphoria, but just had nothing to explain it. Wouldn't even know where to start on trying to explain it. But because we live in a society of men and women, boys and girls, I can, look to the opposite sex, so to speak, and feel that dysphoria through that experience.
Okay.
Which isn't, again, another circular answer based, it's very circumstantial. There's a lot of circularity and circumstantialness to all this.
So if that's the case, then does that really concern us if this is something we are teaching to our kids, it's just a Band-Aid to a problem?
Well, it shouldn't be, gender theory shouldn't be taught, but cases of gender dysphoria should be addressed in the best way possible, acknowledging that it's imperfect.
Yeah. It's
again,
it's because it is such a nuanced conversation, and we've been dancing with this chat for over an hour, and it's really difficult to get to the bottom of it, and trying to navigate this exact sort of scenario with a 6 or 7 year old, which we're starting to see in schools, is it's beyond me that they can think they can actually try and address this topic with any sort of nuance with our children, without affecting the way they think about things and potentially harming them long term. Because maybe we can use this as a good segue to talk about detransitioning, because there have been horror stories, and again, I don't want to use the polarized and politicized views of two different sides, the black and white. People detransition and they're in a lot of pain, and people transition and they're loving life and I feel a lot better about it. But there are people who do fall for this idea of, no, I was just gay, or I was very confused, or I had some pretty severe mental health problems. When it starts to become a mainstream idea, that's probably the biggest concern, that we're going to see more and more and more of this. What are your thoughts on that?
Which is why the big issues, in my view, are as I mentioned before, your freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, freedom of association, especially freedom of association in Australia, because I see Sal's freedom of association was crushed. She wasn't even running a government agency; she was running her own private app, and chucking their parental rights. Parental rights are linked to those freedoms that I mentioned. Those are the big issues. Yeah, sure, we've got cost of living issues, and I don't want to discount that. It's a cost of living election we've got coming up in Australia. But if you don't have those freedoms protected, if you don't have that kind of freedom culture, you have a warped society. If we had those freedoms protected, you're more likely to see is institutions who are not captured or gotten itself out of being captured because there's a competing of ideas. And then you have some parents who think, who freely think, oh yeah, if it's bad enough, the child's gender dysphoria should be dealt with through transition. And then you have other parents who think, oh, actually, that's a bad idea. And then you have this clash of ideas that can be tested out through science or just through life in general. You have a more dynamic society. We currently, Australians are laid back, but unfortunately, we're laid back in a way that at times isn't doing us favors. The management of the response to the pandemic in Australia is a classic example of that.
Okay. All right. Well, let's entertain this idea that all that matters is how you feel, because that's all we can go by at the moment. So we'll establish that as that's what's happening. All that matters is how you feel. What does it matter then if you need to transition your body? Why is that? Is that just for your own acceptance of yourself? Or are we going down a path where we need to teach people who are suffering gender dysphoria that they need to accept the body that they've been given, and that's part of the process, and that's and it's beautiful as well. It's the differences we see between men and women are beautiful and should be celebrated, and potentially the differences between transgender people and women and men should be celebrated. Could we look at it in that way, from a different perspective, and not necessarily you are a woman, you are a man?
So if I was on the show with Sal, one of my pressing questions to her would have been, because you made a similar point, what does acceptance look like? Like in practice, what does it look like? Now, I can give you the Catholic version of that. And if you just give me a moment, I've got my bookcase, which has a particular books. So just give me a moment.
Oh, all good.
Okay. So,
Yep.
okay, so the Virgin Mary and Theology of the Body. Now, this is a commentary book. It's not like an original of the work that I'm about to refer to, the original work being Pope St. John Paul II's Theology of the Body, which was a series of lectures he gave when he was Pope. This is in the late 70s and early 80s. Theology of the Body was a body of theological study, shall we say, on the body, and it was seemingly convoluted, very lengthy. And there's been a whole bunch in the Catholic world. There's been a whole bunch of academic commentary on it since. But if we had to distill that down to 2 points in less than 1 minute, which would do it some injustice, but anyway, point number one, we're an embodied spirit. So we're not just a soul or just a body, we're body and soul. That's point number one out of that. And point number two, for body and soul, the body is a gift from God. So the translation for that series of lectures that he gave is about this thick. I've just distilled it in less than 1 minute, in the way I've distilled it.
Don't worry, our listeners would be very familiar with that concept.
Sorry?
Our listeners would be very familiar with that concept.
Yeah, so which goes back to a point you make about the beauty of it, in this case, the beauty of the body. And look, I've studied it. I've read bits and pieces. It's part of my studies. That's one approach of acceptance. But having studied what I've studied, it's not that I disagree with the truth, goodness, and beauty. That hasn't swayed me. And there's almost like a part of me hasn't swayed.
See, and this is
somewhere my mind hasn't been swayed.
Well, this is where we would see some irony within the people who are on this side, and probably more on the extreme left, leaning sort of people, we would see this idea of body positivity, acceptance, embrace the body you've been given when it comes to overweight women. But then when it comes to transgender, they would be, no, accept what they want to do is transition their body, let them be a woman. And they're the same people. And we see that. And that's ironic that they be preaching acceptance of your body and what you've been given in one hand, and in the other hand saying, no, that they should be allowed to transition. They should be part of society. This is what we're seeing.
We live in an age of relativism. Everything is morally relative. There's no consistent philosophy. You believe what you want to believe. Your truth is your truth. My truth is my truth. Don't argue with my truth. If you do argue, you're a bigot or something like that. Mm-hmm. If I could have proposed to you another irony, online and in person, at certain protests and political events, I have come across some sex-based rights advocates who, one or two women who've challenged me, because I'm also pro-life, one of the set of more conservative views I have. They would challenge me in the sense of, you can tell that they're more pro-choice than pro-life. They might make some snide remark along the lines of, well, fancy you, a man, being pro-life.
That's interesting, because they're also the first people to suggest calling you a man is transphobic.
Oh no, I'm talking about. I'm referring to. Well, there's that lot as well, but the people I'm referring to is the sex-based rights advocates.
Okay, yeah.
They're probably your older school feminists who, for obvious reasons, aren't on board with trans ideology. But the reason I'm pro-life is, well, in my view, the question of where does life start? Well, you can try to have a scientific debate about when the heart is developed, when the mind is developed, the brain is developed.
Yeah.
But I go to the fundamental of, well, it all starts at conception, does it not? And of course, there's a double irony there in what I just said, because I basically said life starts at human conception, yet I'm also the trans woman who can't even explain the gender dysphoria that she experiences in a philosophically coherent way. Mm. Now, I'm just admitting to you a shortcoming, a flaw that I can't get out of. The book I just waved earlier, it's a really beautiful book, like John Paul II's works on theology of the body and a whole bunch of other, he's one of my favorite saints. You can read a whole bunch of beautiful things, but sometimes the mind, or in my case, my mind, there's clearly something in it that is untouchable, even if I want it to be touched by truth, goodness, and beauty. Rather than medical academia getting involved, being woke and letting itself being captured, they're the more interesting scientific questions that I'd like answered. Now, I'm not necessarily suggesting, could someone please invent a pill I can just take, drink, swallow, and all of a sudden my dysphoria growing up all of a sudden disappears, because then I have to if that was to actually happen, then I'd have to detransition, and then I'm in a world of hurt yet again. I think that would just be a really terrible idea. I've made the life choices I've made. That's done and dusted. But there are far more interesting things, like why is it that Dana's doing a master's in Catholic theology and she still doesn't get it? Why?
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah. It just keeps coming back to this. This conversation's very nuanced. It's not a black and white issue. Sorry, go on.
I was just going to say, do we live in a universe, or do we live in a multiverse, or do we live in a whatever you may have seen in recent television shows?
Well, it was
like, we may never find out.
Well, this is the only way in my logic and reasoning, because I'm quite a spiritual person myself. I do believe in past lives, and if the only way I can logically put it down to making sense is that they're tapping into a past life where they were potentially a different gender. That's my own. And some people would call that fucking crazy. Like the fact that I think there's past lives, and they think that there's a potential that they're tapping into that sort of idea. That was all I could. That was the only way I could understand it in any sort of way. And the fact that you, who are experiencing it, cannot explain it and cannot articulate it in a way that is, acceptable for people to understand, that makes that makes this conversation just even harder.
It does. Look, what you just said about it was a point of reincarnation you made. I believe there are at least some Buddhist scholars who've dabbled in that idea, because they'd have an opinion about trans issues like everyone else. They have dabbled with that idea. I haven't read into it. I am aware that it's been dabbled in the Buddhist scholarly world. There's not a satisfactory answer. I don't think there ever will, unless you want to settle for straight up biological reality or straight up gender ideology. But though there's a level of dissatisfaction with those sides of the spectrum as well.
Is it easier to just suggest that it is a delusion and we're trying to handle it in the best way possible?
In this context, the use of the word delusion would make sense.
Wow. Okay.
So, if I had some medical condition where, I'm looking at something, people are saying it's the color red, and I say, no, it's blue. And they prove to me there's a medical condition that's making me say, no, you're saying it's blue because this is what's making you see it's blue, but it's actually red. And here's the scientific proof that it's red because it's somewhere on the spectrum of rays or whatever it's called, and therefore scientifically you're wrong. Well, if someone sees something that's blue when it's really red, how do you? So in that case, you could call it a delusion, but it's a delusion based on based on convincing evidence.
Okay.
That's how we know it's a delusion.
Yeah.
And in my case, you just refer to biology and then you can draw the conclusion it's a delusion. Of course, the word delusion has a whole bunch of baggage along with it.
Of course.
But that's really a separate conversation.
Well, when it comes down to this then, if we approach it from a biological point of view, now we're starting to see it extend into what I believe to be ridiculous circumstances, which is women's sports. And we can go through the certain attributes of a biological male and what they're going to have an advantage over a woman when it comes to a physical sport. Even just as much as their tendons are thicker naturally, their cardiovascular abilities are larger, their muscle growth, their testosterone, these sorts of things, their bone density. these are all just biological things, largely speaking. There are outliers, of course. But when we see this now starting to stem into the sporting arena, this is an issue that, one, I can see being abused by people who have bad intentions, poor intentions, just abusing a system to accept them as they are to win. But then also the danger is people who are potentially suffering from this body dysmorphia, they truly do believe they are a female, are going to be advantaged, and it is going to hurt women in the sporting arena and potentially physically if we come to physical sports.
This has been a PR disaster for the trans rights activists who've got involved in this specific trans debate. It's a PR disaster in that putting them aside, as more and more people coming out, so to speak, and transitioning, we knew that this issue would become an issue. It would become a question of, what do we do with trans women? And there's a whole lot more of them than there used to be.
Yeah.
So what's the best approach? The way certain trans activists handled this matter was, but trans women are women, and you tack onto that the argument of there aren't too many of them, but of course there's more trans women than there used to be 10 years ago, which back 10 years ago there were more trans women than even before that. So really, when you had your smaller PR disasters like there's a name, I think her name is Fallon Fox, MMA fighter in America. This is probably going back a decade ago. I think Fallon Fox was her name. Went through medically transitioned for a couple of years, then started getting involved in mixed martial arts. And then there was someone figured out later on that actually it's a trans woman. And there was an uproar over that. And that really, I think that specific case really started the conversation in the US. And that would have been a great time to have, on the part of the trans rights activists, to have some foresight and figure out, okay, we can't just manage this case. There's going to be more trans people coming into women's sports over years. How can this be stringently managed so that we don't have a situation where various sporting bodies around the world have, in the last year or so, backflipped? So, the swinging of the pendulum, with anything in life, you don't want the pendulum to swing too much. You only want a little bit of swinging, not too much swinging. It causes a whole bunch of unintended consequences. Whether you agree with those unintended consequences or not, if there's too much pendulum swinging, it sows discord very easily in a long-term way. Issues fester, grievances fester.
So what could have been done instead at that time? Is this a place where they could have said...
Probably a neat approach would have been, okay, look, it hasn't been scientifically studied well enough, but let's err on the side of caution. We're opening a society where more children, for example, are coming out as trans, and at least some of them will probably get on, if managed correctly, they'll get on puberty blockers. And so, they'll grow up having not, in this case, trans girls, having not gone through male puberty. If they do have an advantage, well, they certainly didn't get any of that advantage through male puberty. So an argument could have been made, and I think this is the approach this is the backflip taken by the International Body on Swimming. I don't know what they're called, maybe 2 years ago. Yeah. I think this is in response to the somewhat embarrassing Leah Thomas case in the US.
Yeah.
I think their new approach and their current approach is, if you went through male puberty, no. But if you're trans but you didn't go through male puberty, sure. So at least there's a level of objectivity there.
But then the
argument you could say, well, that's a bit harsh to those who had parents who exercised their parental rights to deny, so to speak, their child to be on blockers to begin with. But the issue of whether parents exercised their parental rights rightly or wrongly, that's a private matter. Not related, well, at least I think it shouldn't be conflated with what we're talking about here. If that's the current approach of the international body, elite body on swimming, that, if you're trans, but if you didn't go through male puberty, it's all good. At least there's a level of objectivity.
Yeah, I mean, I agree, but also I'm not sure I agree from my point of view that kids should be put on puberty blockers, but I understand the concept what you're saying. But it does seem that there was more of a no, we're just going to lean into this idea of acceptance no matter what. We're going to ignore biology, we're going to ignore science, and we're going to do this for the sake of adhering to an ideology that seems to be cancelling anyone who disagrees with them. So it just felt like they were doing it for the sake of acceptance. And when it comes to sporting arenas, biology is probably the biggest factor that should be considered.
I heard an argument made, this would have been in recent years, the world body, the sporting body for chess, they banned anyone biologically male from competing in women's chess at the elite level, something along those lines. So initially an argument I heard was, well, it's just chess. The trans woman, there's no way the trans woman's physically beating the other woman on the opposite side. But I've heard the counter argument made being, well, actually, in a chess competition, there's nothing physical, nothing physically dangerous about it. There's no way it could be physically dangerous. But in a chess competition, if the trans woman wins that, say, women's chess at a particular level, it's not about some sort of physical advantage. It's about the trans woman having taken the place of a woman, a cis woman, a woman.
This is where
they took the place of a woman.
Yeah, this is where it's getting a bit blurry, because they've had that recently with the United Kingdom. They had a pool, like a snooker championship, and there's no added advantage. So, I mean, as far as I'm aware, there could be some strength advantages in snooker. Maybe, I don't think there is, but yeah, it's starting to get very blurry. But we need to understand that there are sports that have an advantage physically, and that needs to be addressed.
When I heard that counter argument relating to chess about, well, okay, physically safe, but that's not the point. The point is the trans woman took first place when that could have gone to another woman. When I heard that counter argument, in the lead up to that, I kind of felt like I was in two places in regards to the women's sport debate. And then when I heard that argument, I think I might have turned. It goes back to, again, the question of, well, what is a woman? And you'll recall early on, more than an hour ago, I said something like, walking down the street, you'll be able to figure out what is a woman, not biologically, but through what you see. Again, not a satisfactory answer, but I'm just trying to give you one version of a realistic answer.
Yeah.
So if I was to, I mean, I play chess myself, although recreationally, for the fun of it. So if I, you didn't know who Dana Pham was, and if you Googled Dana Pham and you couldn't see any Google results relating to being trans, the world had no idea that I'm trans.
Yeah.
And I went to a chess competition. I won the women's
Yeah.
at some level. Okay, well, it doesn't matter. But it does matter until someone finds out. And of course, when someone finds out, there are questions.
Yeah. It does become
No.
politicized.
Any reason why you weren't so forthcoming, which then becomes an awkward conversation. And I tend to be transparent with people. For example, in the dating scene, I'm transparent.
Transparent that you're transgender.
Well, I didn't intend that pun. It just came out of my mouth.
Yeah. No, I think some things are used to sow division and hatred and used as a political, a political ideology to run on and so to sow that division. But there are areas that need to be addressed, and obviously, I look at my daughter coming up into a world where I want her to succeed, and I don't want people to take advantage of that system and take away her opportunities. But I do understand what you're saying in regards to sometimes it's just being used for the sake of an argument.
Sorry, go.
Well, so where do we go from here? Because it is so divisive. It's been made divisive, I feel, intentionally, almost as a distraction. How do we bridge a gap between both sides, and where do we go from here?
Easier said than done. I said that more trans people should be more libertarian. Well, I don't think it's just trans people. I think it's people in general. Of course, this isn't. We won't have too much time to go into why libertarianism as a political philosophy is better than the rest. But I think it's the cleanest in helping navigate these frictions and conflicts. I think, I take a libertarian approach. I think more trans people should take it. So someone needs to start taking a more libertarian approach, which is why I tend to take a libertarian approach, because a lot of trans people, they tend to be lefties, which is kind of annoying. Yeah. It'd be nice if we could visibly see more variety of them, but you don't. You get the big. There's one or two big names on the internet, like Blair White in the United States. I mean, you don't really have any standouts in the online trans community that are visible. A lot of them are just, for whatever reason, they're lefties. I guess it's just easier that way.
Well,
for obvious reasons.
I'll use Charlie Kirk as an example, and sometimes I think that maybe he just gets people on who are idiots, and he puts clips up that are people who are idiots, and it makes them look stupid. That was what I thought. And then I started to think, well, maybe, and this is maybe everyone on the left, extreme left, is an idiot. Maybe that's all it is. But hearing someone who's logical about the explanation, like you talk about it and just say and openly suggest that there's no coherent and accepted way I can explain to you what it is. It does make that a very interesting, almost ideologically aligned argument now instead. It feels like I'm on the left. I have to believe this no matter what. And I've started to talk about this tribalism a lot, culture wars. It's like we've aligned with a side, and no matter what that side does, right or wrong, we agree with it, both ways. And I don't think that's the way forward. I think there is a middle way. There is a nice, compassionate way that people can understand that we all want the same thing, which is we all want to be accepted. We all want love. We all want everyone to be happy, healthy, and prosper. That's what everyone. There are some outliers, some fucking evil people in the world, I get, but they're very minimal. We just all disagree on the pathway there. And I just don't foresee a way forward on this issue when there's not a coherent way of explaining what it is.
I don't think you'd need a coherent philosophy. I don't think a coherent explanation is required. I think that's more of a side point. What's more important is those freedoms I mentioned earlier. There needs to be a consistent approach to freedom and liberty.
Yeah.
So freedom of speech, we know that freedom of speech doesn't necessarily mean freedom to say everything or almost, it's not the freedom to say literally whatever you want. Because if I could say, let's say I said nasty things about, say, your parents, I assume you love your parents, and I decided to say nasty things to your parents. Mm-hmm. Well, what's the basis of all these freedoms I mentioned earlier? Property rights. I'm currently on your property, and I've exercised if I was to say nasty things about your parents, I've exercised my freedom in a way that is inappropriate. So what you then do is you kick me off this show.
Yeah.
So being mindful that it's not just all about freedom of speech. There's a whole range of freedoms, along with, we talked about parental rights, and of course, all that, the foundation of all that is property rights. If we as a society, if we moved more towards a culture of understanding what freedom means in that multidimensional way, I think everyone would be more mindful and not necessarily less honest, more honest in a more mindful way that can then produce these kind of conversations.
Yeah.
Can we achieve that? It takes a culture change. It takes an educational change. Maybe we should do something about fixing those 3 R's in the schooling system first. Get a few priorities right, like the ones I mentioned. If we as a society work on those cultural shortcomings, but to more to your point, where do we start? Well, it'd be nice if there was at least one other trans person in Australia does what I do. Yeah. Come on your show, get out there to get involved in political protests, go to political events. Like I go to all sorts of, especially in Sydney, all sorts of political events that are right-wing, centre-right, those kind of events. And, I get the occasional raised eyebrow, but it's better for me to make a presence, to start that, to offer an open door to have a conversation if that other person wants. And of course, going up to a lot of these, in future, we might we might see a return to more a variety of left-wing protests in Sydney, not just about the Gaza-Palestine issue, more variety like there used to be in Sydney, left-wing protests where, other than just myself, rocks up with a more nuanced sign and let them know, I can also hold a sign, and I think you're kind of misbehaving in the way you're carrying on, and I want to set a different example. I don't want to just be that only person. It'd be great if other people did as well.
Creating that understanding between, which would I think you're sort of you've admitted or spoken to in this episode is that there is an element of mental health or an element of mental health to this that needs to be addressed, and is understood that it is we use the word delusion. That feels a bit almost attacking, but I'm just using it for lack of a better word.
You could substitute it for misaligned, misunderstood.
Yeah.
I think it kind of means the same thing in this context.
Yeah. And so to have some people within the trans community start to suggest that it is what we're seeing, that is, and it has to be treated with nuance. We can't just attack these people. We need to care for these people because they've gone through a lot already, and by pushing them away doesn't create connection. It doesn't create a bridge between the two sort of societies that we're seeing, the sectors. That doesn't necessarily either side needs to admit right or wrong. It just needs to understand that each other think completely differently and accept that. I do think that the reason we're seeing the conflict at the moment is this forcing of it into our schools specifically. That seems to be the biggest one. Aside from that, I feel like people will just, no, it's all good. Go about your business. It's all, I'm going to accept you as you are. I don't think that's what it is, but I'm just going to accept you to do what you want. That's what I think it was until it was this state-enforced terms, pronouns, the state-enforced learning in school. That was where the issues really began, I think, and it can be solved by not forcing this issue on everyone that doesn't necessarily agree with it. That'd be like me forcing you to be a Buddhist or forcing you to not be a Catholic. Like it's not my right to be able to do that, and it's not my right to be able to enforce these things in school.
Clearly there needs to be more. I'm sure you and I can think of certain people who should be in the room, or certain types of people who should be in the room right now, but getting them in the room, if you can get them in a room, that's already half the challenge. Yeah,
well, I'd certainly appreciate what you're doing, and I think our listeners appreciate what you're doing. I think I hope the trans community appreciates what you're doing, because what you're doing, I think, is breaking down some walls where we're starting to see that it's not the stereotypes that we see on the news or on quick reels that we see that are never framed in a positive way. So I do appreciate what you're doing and the message that you're trying to push. Is there anything you want to chat about before we finish up? Because we've been going for a fair chunk, nearly a couple of hours now. So,
probably the last point I'll make is I'm a note that a note on the point you've just made. If you ever see a what are they called? Drag queen story time, those silly things they run at some of the libraries. It's clearly an indoctrination exercise, completely unnecessary. But if you ever see me at one of those reading to the kids, but not dressed as a drag queen, dressed normally, dressed how I am right now, and you can't tell if I'm a drag queen or not. I just look like a woman who's, just reading hopefully some age-appropriate book to the kids. If you ever see that one day, you'll then know that the tide is turning in a way that brings people together, because that would probably be one of the most normal things that could happen, and it would be unreal. But we can only hope that day will come.
Yeah, of course. Well, thank you so much for coming on. I'm glad we could have this conversation, and if you're ever in Perth at some time, we should get you back on and we can have a chat with Delby as well.
Okay.
Really do appreciate your time. Is there anything you want to plug before we finish up?
I am active on social media. I did mention I have a blog, and I've written for The Spectator Australia previously, amongst other things. If people are interested in checking out my previous work, following me, just type in Dana Pham. So go to Google and type in DANA space PHAM. Most of the results, it's to do with one of my social media accounts. Maybe follow one of those, whatever tickles one's fancy. You can also check out my blog, which can be convoluted, and I've contributed to other publications as well.
Well, thank you so much for your time, and we appreciate the conversation we've just had, and I'm sure we'll speak soon.
Cheers. Thank you.